Let me begin with the historical coincidence I find most fascinating and ironic of all that has happened since my death. I published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the same year the 13 colonies declared their independence from Great Britain. I devoted a substantial portion of that book to demonstrating that the colonial mercantilist system was economically absurd for the mother country, that the costs of defending and administering the colonial empire far outweighed the commercial benefits it generated, and that Great Britain would be better off trading freely with independent colonies than spending fortunes keeping them subjugated. I was right in that diagnosis, and the subsequent history of Great Britain, which prospered commercially after gradually losing its colonial empire, largely confirmed that prediction. But what I did not anticipate, and I must admit this with the same honesty with which I have admitted other limitations in these debates, is the specific form that American power would take. I assumed, perhaps too optimistically, that a nation founded on principles of free trade and a rejection of mercantilism would develop an international order based on voluntary exchange between sovereign nations. What transpired was more complex and, from my perspective, more contradictory. The United States effectively built a system of global hegemony that has components I would immediately recognize as mercantilist in its structure. A network of 800 military bases in more than 70 countries whose cost exceeds $100 billion annually, a system of economic sanctions that uses access to the American market and the dollar-based financial system as a weapon of geopolitical coercion, and massive subsidies to industries considered strategic that distort international competition in exactly the same way as the classical colonial mercantilism I criticized. The difference that its defenders would point out, and which has some merit, is that the global order the United States built after 1945 was not purely extractive like classical colonial mercantilism. The Bretton Woods system, the GATT, the WTO, the opening of the American market to exports from allied countries, all of this contributed to an expansion of global trade that raised living standards in many parts of the world, including countries that were not Washington's military allies. In that sense, the American hegemonic order had genuinely liberal components in trade matters that classical mercantilism lacked. But that distinction has eroded considerably in recent decades. When the United States uses the dollar as a weapon of sanctions, when it imposes unilateral tariffs invoking national security, when it subsidizes its semiconductor or electric vehicle industries to exclude foreign competitors, it is doing exactly what I criticized the East India Company and the 18th century mercantilists for, using the power of the state to protect private and national interests, instead of letting free competition determine who produces what most efficiently. The direct answer to your question, then, is this. Yes, the United States has developed in its imperial maturity many of the mercantilist traits that its founders, inspired in part by my ideas, claimed to repudiate. Real economic power, as your question suggests, seems to require in practice more state intervention than my theory prescribed. That doesn't make me an advocate of such interventionism. It forces me to ask myself whether I underestimate the dimension of power in international economic relations, too readily assuming that free markets between nations would produce mutually beneficial outcomes without anyone attempting to seize asymmetric advantages by force. American hegemony demonstrates something my model of international trade did not sufficiently incorporate, that in the absence of a global arbiter with coercive power, the most powerful nations have permanent incentives to distort the system in their favor.
and that the nation that defines the rules of international trade, like Great Britain in the 19th century and the United States in the 20th, tends to define them in a way that favors its own interests, calling free trade what is in reality trade on its terms.
This question fills me with something close to indignation, because it perfectly describes what I warned about most vehemently throughout my work, and which no one took seriously enough. I was relentless in my critique of the monopolies and privileged corporations of my time. The East India Company was, in my analysis, a private government disguised as a commercial enterprise. It had its own armies, administered territories, dictated terms to suppliers and buyers, and influenced Parliament to protect its privileges. I described it as one of the most damaging institutions to genuinely free trade that existed in the world at that time. And my criticism wasn't merely moral, it was economic. Monopoly destroys competition, which is the mechanism by which the market produces efficiency and general benefit. Now you describe the corporate landscape of the United States in the 21st century, and what I hear is the East India Company with smartphones and algorithms. Apple controls the operating system through which users access applications and charges a 30% commission on every transaction on its platform, simply for owning the gateway. Google processes more than 90% of internet searches globally and sells advertising based on that dominant position. Meta controls the world's leading social media networks. Amazon is simultaneously the dominant e-commerce platform and the largest provider of cloud computing infrastructure for thousands of companies that compete against its own products on that same platform. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street hold significant stakes in virtually every major publicly traded corporation, creating a form of cross-ownership that dilutes competition among nominally rival companies. These are not companies that gained their dominant position simply by being more efficient in a competitive market. They gained that position and maintain it through what economists call network effects, which create self-reinforcing advantages and make it nearly impossible for new competitors to enter the market. Through the systematic acquisition of potential rivals before they can grow large enough to threaten them, Facebook bought Instagram and WhatsApp, Google bought YouTube, Amazon bought every company that showed potential to compete in their markets, and through political lobbying that has transformed these corporations into some of the largest funders of electoral campaigns and employers of former regulatory officials in Washington. This last point is what has most troubled me since my inception. I explicitly warned in The Wealth of Nations that the owners of capital have interests that frequently diverge from the public interest, and that they will always seek to expand their market control and restrict competition whenever possible. That is why the role of the state in competition is not optional in my system. It is a necessary condition for the market to function. A state that does not prevent monopolistic concentration is not defending the free market. It is abdicating the only function I assigned it in the private economic sphere. Has the American state failed in this? The answer is unequivocally yes, and the reasons are understandable, though not justifiable. The American political system, with its private campaign financing, its revolving door between industry and regulators, and its legislative process that favors organized interest groups over dispersed consumers, has been systematically captured by the very corporations it's meant to regulate. Antitrust laws have existed since Sherman in 1890, but their application for decades was so restrictive, requiring proof of immediate consumer harm in terms of prices, ignoring the concentration of power as a problem in itself, that it enabled the consolidation we see today. Can the market correct itself? In this specific case, my honest answer is no. The network effects that sustain these platforms' dominant position are barriers to entry that spontaneous competition cannot overcome. A new search engine that is marginally better than Google will not gain users because all other users are on Google.
A new social network that is more privacy conscious will not attract anyone because their contacts are on Meta. The competition I described as the natural corrector of market abuses works when markets are contestable. These are not. The only response consistent with my own principles is aggressive state intervention, breaking up companies where concentration is structural, prohibiting acquisitions that eliminate potential competitors, and mandating interoperability to reduce the effects.
This is the question that most directly challenges me as the author of the theory of self-interest as the driving force of collective well-being, and I will answer it without evasion because you deserve it. My proposition was never that individual selfishness automatically produces collective well-being under any circumstances and without institutional conditions. That is a caricature of my argument that has been perpetuated by both my most enthusiastic followers and my harshest critics, and both have done me a disservice. What I argued was something more precise and more conditional, that when individuals pursue their self-interest in a market with genuine competition, with reasonably accessible information, with institutions that enforce contracts and protect property without favoring some over others, the result tends to be a more efficient allocation of resources than that produced by any central planner. These conditions are essential for the argument to work. Without them, it doesn't work. Now I examine the United States in 2026 and ask whether those conditions are met. Genuine competition? We've already discussed this, and the answer is that in key sectors it has been replaced by oligopoly. Accessible information? In the markets for healthcare, housing, higher education, and financial services, the information asymmetry between providers and consumers is so great that consumers cannot make genuinely informed decisions. Institutions that do not favor some over others? We've discussed regulatory capture and corporate lobbying, which systematically tilt the rules of the game in favor of those who already own more. Under these conditions, my proposition about self-interest and collective well-being does not predict the outcome observed in the United States. It predicts exactly what is observed: accumulation at the top, stagnation in the middle, and persistent poverty at the bottom, because the conditions for the mechanism to function properly have been progressively eroded. That said, I must go further and acknowledge something that deeply unsettles my original formulations. There are sectors of the economy where the self-interest mechanism consistently produces poor results regardless of the quality of institutions, because the characteristics of those goods prevent the market from allocating them efficiently. Healthcare is the most dramatic and pertinent example for the United States today. A purely private healthcare market has three problems that no amount of regulation can fully resolve. First, demand is not voluntary. When someone needs urgent medical care, they cannot simply forego it or compare prices among providers as they would among bakeries. This destroys the consumer's bargaining power that drives the market. Second, information is radically asymmetrical. The doctor knows infinitely more about what the patient needs than the patient, creating opportunities for oversupply of services that the market cannot correct on its own. Third, and most fundamentally, allowing people who cannot pay to die produces social costs, uncontrolled epidemics, disabled workers, broken families that fall on the entire society. Exclusion by price, which is the normal market rationing mechanism, produces massive negative externalities in the healthcare sector, rendering the market outcomes suboptimal, even from a strictly efficiency-driven perspective. The result of ignoring this for decades in the United States is a healthcare system that spends 17% of GDP, more than double Canada's percentage, and produces worse outcomes in life expectancy, infant mortality, and overall population health than virtually all developed countries with universal systems. This is not a defense of the free market, it is its empirical refutation in this specific sector.
Student debt is another systemic failure rooted in deliberate political decisions, not in the natural functioning of the market. When the government gradually withdraws funding from public college education and replaces it with loans that students must take out at market rates, it creates exactly the kind of trap I would have criticized. Young people taking on massive debt to acquire a credential that the job market demands, without reliable information about whether that credential will allow them to pay for it. And in a market where colleges, protected by accreditation barriers and without real competitive pressure, can raise their prices indefinitely, knowing that federal funding will cover the difference. It's a transfer of wealth from middle-class youth to educational institutions.
This is the most personal question of the entire debate, and the most difficult to answer honestly, because it mixes economic analysis with counterfactual historical speculation, which is the most slippery ground there is for a thinker who prides himself on basing his conclusions on empirical observation. I must begin with the context that many ignore. I proposed the integration of the American colonies into the British Parliament not out of love for the empire, but out of consistency with my own principles. If the colonies paid taxes to the Crown, they had the right to representation in the body that levied them. Taxation without representation was, from my perspective, a violation of the basic principles of political justice that I defended. My proposal for integration was, in that sense, more radical than it seemed. It implied transforming the British Empire into something radically different, a federation of territories with equal representation that would have been an unprecedented institutional revolution. Was it realistic? Honestly, no. The British Parliament of 1776 had no intention of granting full representation to 3 million American colonists, who, projecting the population growth I myself observed, would have surpassed the population of the British Isles within a few decades, and numerically dominated any joint legislative body. The British political class fully understood this arithmetic, and that is why they never seriously considered full integration. My proposal was, in retrospect, more an exercise in political logic than a politically viable alternative. So would it have been better economically? In the very short term, avoiding war would have spared both sides the devastating costs of conflict. But beyond that, speculation becomes genuinely uncertain. On one hand, it could be argued that an Anglo-American federation with free internal trade, common institutions, and the mobility of capital and labor could have produced an extraordinarily powerful economic entity from the outset. The size of the unified internal market would have been unparalleled in the 19th century world. The synergies between British capital and manufacturing and American natural resources and territory would have been formidable. On the other hand, there are reasons to doubt that such a scenario would have been sustainable or even desirable. The tensions between a metropolis and agricultural colonies would not have disappeared simply because of formal integration. They would have found other avenues of conflict. Slavery, which I did not discuss centrally enough in my writings, an omission for which history rightly reproaches me, would have been as explosive a breaking point within an Anglo-American federation as it was within the United States itself, perhaps even more, because British abolitionism and Southern slavery would have clashed within the same institutional framework with unpredictable results. And there is the question that your question implies without directly stating it. Would a political entity like the United States, with its constitution, its federalism, its civil liberties, its specific national identity, have existed without the rupture of 1776? I don't think so. Independence was not merely an economic event, it was the invention of a form of government and a collective identity that influenced all subsequent independence and democratization movements around the world. The French Revolution, the Latin American independence movements, the European constitutionalist movements of the 19th century, all looked to the American experiment as a point of reference. This global political effect of American independence is something that no purely economic analysis can capture. So my final answer, and the most honest one I can give, is this. I don't know if the world would have been better off with a pan-Atlantic union. I know it would have been politically different in ways I cannot confidently predict. And I know that the 250 years of American history, with all the contradictions we have discussed today, produced something I could not have anticipated in 1776. The most extensive and imperfect, yet also the richest in lessons, demonstration of what happens when the principles of free markets and political liberty are applied on a continental scale for generations. What that history demonstrates neither confirms nor refutes my theories in a simple way. It complicates them, it enriches them, it challenges them. And that, for a thinker, is perhaps the most valuable legacy a nation can offer.